Hello everybody, it is World Endometriosis Day and I'd like to welcome all our viewers from across the globe to the Endometriosis Australia Symposium for Endo March. My name is Snook and I'm a proud endo warrior and ambassador for Endometriosis Australia, and I look forward to bringing you the wonderful lineup of guests we have here with us today. It is quite extraordinary. To commence our symposium, I'd like to introduce you to our keynote speaker, patient advocate and film producer, Shannon Cohn. You might have come across Shannon's famous TED Talk where she spoke about the most common disease you've never heard of and the film Endo What, which Shannon produced. Here, all the way from New York in the United States, Shannon Cohn, welcome to the studio.
So in Australia and across the world, tremendous progress has been made in recent years. And now the question remains, where do we go from here? The future of endometriosis care starts here and now. We must take an honest look at the present in order to get to the future that all of us as patients and as providers deserve, a future in which we not only survive, but we thrive. For those who don't know my background, I'm an attorney and a documentary filmmaker. And by necessity, I'm also an endometriosis patient advocate. Like many here, I first had endo symptoms as a teenager at 16 years old, and yet I didn't hear the word endometriosis until I was 29, despite it wreaking absolute havoc on my personal and professional life for the 13 years in between. During those 13 years, I survived a demanding career practicing international law. I survived pursuing my passion of aid work, traveling to places on the planet where the only medical care was a Doctors Without Borders tent. And I survived while on set on my feet for 12-hour filming days while producing movies in New York City. I survived even though my personal relationship suffered and my body suffered as my endometriosis progressed and worsened. Throughout those 13 years, I survived through disbelief by certain healthcare providers, multiple misdiagnoses, and then failed treatments by well-meaning but misinformed doctors. After multiple ineffective ablation surgeries by my OBGYN, who, by the way, is a lovely person and has since delivered my children, through word of mouth and sheer luck, I found an endometriosis specialist who performed excision surgery and, just as importantly, in my opinion, introduced me to a multidisciplinary treatment paradigm, which I still benefit from today. For me, this means following an anti-inflammatory diet, mindfulness practices, breath work, acupuncture, and yes, at times medications, both Chinese herbal medicines and pharmaceuticals when needed. My long-delayed diagnosis is not unique. That's no surprise to anyone here today. Millions of others with endo are forced to do the same in varying degrees. Whatever professional and personal accomplishments we may have during this time, this delayed diagnosis time, they are usually despite the care we receive, or lack of care sometimes. They're despite the care, not because of the care. When I finally learned what good care for endometriosis actually looks like, I decided to turn my lens, my film lens, on it, to examine this disease and why it seems so difficult to find good care, especially in this age of modern medicine. And what I found was shocking. And the deeper I dug, the more astonished I became. Endo What, which incidentally screened in partnership with Endometriosis Australia across the country in several cities in 2016. I made Endo What. I made this film in an effort to give patients an accurate base of knowledge from experts, to put power in their hands to give them a tool to seek better care. And since 2016, tremendous progress has been made in the US and Australia and many other countries around the world, with Australia leading the way and patient advocacy organizations working together to form the Australian Coalition for Endometriosis. And they worked with other stakeholders to create the National Action Plan for Endo in 2018, a truly revolutionary plan that we in the US and other parts of the world are still looking at in our own efforts to emulate and enact here. That said, Of course, several hurdles still remain, despite the fact that endometriosis affects upwards or almost 1 million Australian individuals and 200 million individuals worldwide. The time frame from the onset of symptoms to diagnosis is still too long. Even if it's decreasing to 6 years or 7 years, it's still too long. This is still in large part based on the pervasiveness of outdated thinking and misinformation. Starting at the most basic level with the widespread inability to properly define endometriosis itself correctly, a definition that's tissue similar to the uterine lining rather than the incorrect displaced uterine tissue. And it's also due to a fundamental misframing of endometriosis as a menstrual disorder that only causes painful periods and sometimes causes infertility, when it's a disease that is so much more than that. Furthermore, OBGYNs, pediatricians, general practitioners, and nurses are generally not properly educated on endometriosis. Yes, that's changing, but still it means that as frontline providers, they often fail to recognize symptoms. And secondly, they turn to outdated treatment paradigms, sometimes like hysterectomy and medications that treat symptoms rather than the disease, because it's what they know and it fits within their skill set. The new clinical guidelines in Australia, recently released by Health Minister Greg Hunt in May 2021, are a great step forward to changing this devastating narrative. Yet it still remains to be seen, how their impact will be felt on the lives of endometriosis patients long term. There is reason for great optimism. There's reason for great optimism, but there's no time to be complacent. The issues we face are, of course, influenced in some way by pervasive sexism and how the history of marginalizing women has played a role in our understanding and treatment of a disease like endometriosis. And finally, I hate to say it, but it's true. Endometriosis is a field mired in egos and politics, individual, organizational, institutional, national, which have held real progress in this disease back to the great harm of patients, and also providers interested in specializing in endometriosis care. And unfortunately, this is international in nature. It's not limited to the US or Australia, but within all countries and regions. These are the hurdles that we face, yet no reason to be discouraged. The first step in solving a problem is to be aware that the problem exists and just knowing that solutions are in fact forming. When filming Endo What, I spoke with many experts and leaders in this field, and they all told me the same thing off camera. They said if change is to come in endometriosis, it will be led by the patient community. Patient advocates must sit at the table alongside other stakeholders, healthcare providers, government entities, government leaders. That's something that is actively happening in Australia and something we've also pursued to great success so far in the US. For example, since 2017, we've worked with US senators, namely Elizabeth Warren, Orrin Hatch, and Mitt Romney. And for you guys not familiar, they're on opposite sides of the political spectrum. And really framing the issue as a human issue, not a political issue. And something that affects so many women that all politicians, no matter what their political ideology may be, can care about. And in partnering with these senators, for the first time in history, we secured tens of millions of dollars in research funding for Endo from the Department of Defense, of all places. Notably, approximately 3 million Australian dollars of that funding went to collaborators in Australia at the University of Queensland. And that was for research to determine the cause of endometriosis and the physiological processes associated with the disease. So there we have this great international collaboration. Further, we continue our work with the senators and the newly formed bipartisan House Endometriosis Caucus in the US. And last year, we doubled NIH funding for endo research from 13 million US dollars to 26 million US dollars. It's through these direct government partnerships that have been so instrumental in making these huge steps forward, as have direct partnerships in Australia with the government here. These relationships need to continue to be carefully nurtured. And both of these countries, the US and Australia, as well as introduced in countries around the world. And these things are already in development in places like France and Argentina and Canada, to name just a few. The main point is that we are building a larger, more inclusive table, an international table with dialogue and sharing of information, resources, and tools, so that we can all move forward together. Making decisions in a silo isn't working anymore, if it ever has. And the only way we can move forward in a way that truly helps patients is to join together and incorporate patient advocate voices from all walks of life, all countries, in developing awareness and educational initiatives, and developing standards of care and treatment models. I'll conclude my talk with a short sneak peek of our next film, Below the Belt. And this will be released in the US and Australia and other countries around the world later this year. The film is a bit different than Endo What, as it approaches endometriosis as a social justice issue. And it shines a light on many of the issues that I've mentioned here in this talk.
I knew something was weird. I knew something was wrong.
It took me 10 doctors to find someone that believed my pain.
I thought maybe I'm dying or I have some kind of rare disease. Then I go online and find that millions of women are going through exactly what I'm going through.
For those of you who don't know what endometriosis is,
1 out of every 10 women suffer from it.
The disease is a largely ignored aspect in women's healthcare.
Don't exactly trust her telling me that everything's fine.
It's surreal that you get better information from a Facebook group than you do actual doctors.
The idea that women's pain is less relevant, less important, is not acceptable.
The system will be changed within. The revolution will come within.
I'm nervous.
Better diagnosis, better treatment.
If we don't say we're not going to live like this anymore, we're not going to accept this anymore, no one's going to do it for us. It's up to us to make the change.
Thank you so much for your time, and take heart. Things are moving in the right direction in Australia and around the world.
Welcome back. I certainly hope you found Shannon's keynote as insightful and as uplifting as I did, so much so that we're going to keep her around a little bit longer as she joins the next segment of our symposium, our panel Q&A. So these medical and allied health professionals have been selected from across the globe to bring you their expertise and guidance on how we can each live our lives best with endometriosis. I would like to welcome our panellists today. First of all, I am joined by Dr. Jade Acton, gynaecologist and Director of Australia Gynaecological Endoscopy and Surgery Society from Perth, Australia. All the way from the UK, we have Dr. Shaheen Khazali, gynaecologist and pelvic pain specialist. A little closer to home, we're joined by Ruth Schubert, women's health physiotherapist from Byron Bay in regional New South Wales, Australia. And hello again to Shannon Cohn, patient advocate and filmmaker for Endo What from New York in the USA. Back over the other side of the country now, we are joined by Tracy, Gaibisso, Naturopath, Nutritionist and Herbalist from Perth in WA. And last but by no means least, Dr. Mike Armour, Medicinal Cannabis and Complementary Medicine Researcher and the Chair of the Endometriosis Australia Clinical Advisory Committee from Sydney, Australia. So given the various time zones, it's even more exceptional that you can all be here today, so thank you very much. We're going to get through a range of topics today, and a lot of the questions are coming from you, the viewer. We certainly have a lot to get through today, and I'd like to start with you, Dr. Acton. In your role, are you finding surgeries are becoming more common in terms of treatment for endometriosis? And if so, how can we reduce the need for multiple surgeries?
Yeah, so I think that surgery is becoming more common as a treatment for endometriosis, and I think this is probably for 2 main reasons. The first one is I think that there's a greater awareness of the disease amongst the patient population, and so if there's more women who are aware that potentially they have endometriosis, I think there's a movement towards more of them electing to have surgery as part of their treatment. The second reason that I think it's becoming more commonplace is that previously there was probably a culture of ignoring young women with pain periods and other symptoms and encouraging them to go on the pill, to have a baby, to use some of those other types of therapies that we can use. And perhaps we're kind of offering it more than we previously were to a younger population. In terms of the second part of your question about how do we prevent multiple surgeries, that's really important. And the evidence will certainly suggest that if we make sure that the first operation is done well, that we can reduce the need for further surgery in the future. So I think, ensuring that patients have access to gynaecologic surgeons who specialise in endometriosis, who are experienced in the disease, is really important at preventing those repeat surgeries. And then the other thing is ensuring that these same patients are provided with aftercare. And so that ongoing support to prevent the need for another operation.
Dr. Khazali, you see pelvic pain in endometriosis patients. How do we know if pain after surgeries is more endo or if it's a result of scar tissue?
Okay, well, that's a very good question. It is not always easy to differentiate between the two. And we see this in all areas of medicine. Unfortunately, our bodies don't work the way we want it to. So 2 + 2 is not always 4 in medicine. So you can have a symptom that can come from various different pathologies. And this is a very good example. In someone who's had surgery for endometriosis and they have more pain, it's possible that there are adhesions, there is fibrosis. It is possible that there is more endometriosis. And it's also possible that the pain wasn't endometriosis in the first place. There are ways that we can get a clue to which one it is more likely to be, but it's unlikely that we can be absolutely certain which one's which. To give you a couple of examples, pain that is due to endometriosis tends to be cyclical and hormone related, but I think they tends to be is the key word here. It doesn't always work like that. Pain due to adhesions tends to be one-sided, tends to be in one place, one location. It may get worse with movement sometimes, but again, it doesn't always work like that. So all we can do is put all the evidence we have together, examination, ultrasound, sometimes MRI, sometimes we have to do more than that to try and figure out which one of these scenarios is the more likely culprit.
Well, physiotherapy is something that I'm really intrigued by. It's something that I was introduced to late as an endo patient. Ruth, I'll bring you in now. Can you tell us what is a physiotherapist's role in treating and managing pelvic pain?
That's a great question. And I think, first of all, to differentiate physios who specialise in endometriosis treatment, we're generally called pelvic physios. So we do a standard undergraduate degree and then we to go on to do postgraduate specialised training in the area of the pelvis. And I guess a key difference would be between a standard physio and a pelvic physio is that we are trained to assess and treat the internal structures of the pelvis as well, particularly the nervous system and the muscles of the pelvis internally. So a typical role of a pelvic physiotherapist, initially there's obviously a lot of talking so we can listen and understand the story and how endometriosis is impacting you. There is a large education component. There's generally always an exercise component, and whether that's exercise for the external body to help with pain management, strength and conditioning and fatigue management. But generally there's also an exercise component for the internal pelvic structures, particularly the pelvic floor, where we're working on the coordination and quite often the relaxation of the pelvic floor. And of course, we can still do the traditional, what we would call manual therapy treatments as a physiotherapist to the external structures, the back, the pelvis, the abdomen, but we can also do internal treatments to the pelvic floor neuromuscular system.
Tracy, the relationship of diet and endometriosis patients I find to be something so fascinating. It has changed my life. I really want to get your insight on this. Is there any research into the benefits of anti-inflammatory diet and the link to endometriosis.
Okay, so the research on whole diets and endometriosis generally is in its infancy, and we do need to have more research done in this area because it's really, really important. It's quite difficult to do a study on a diet and endometriosis alone and get consistent results, as most of the research asks for recall of the diet afterwards, which is quite hard to get accurate for people. There are some animal studies and some smaller human studies on specific compounds in foods that would normally be in an anti-inflammatory diet, say fish, for example, which has got some anti-inflammatory compounds in it, which has been shown to be beneficial. And that would correlate quite well with what we see clinically too, which is for some people, an anti-inflammatory diet may improve symptoms, specifically more the pain and gut symptoms. It is important to establish, though, that an anti-inflammatory diet may not incorporate the same foods for everybody, as everybody reacts differently. So at this time, I would be sort of suggesting things like a Mediterranean diet to start with, to reduce the amount of synthetic foods or synthetic fats, increase your fibre, have lots of fruit and veggie, less red meat, that type of thing, and then consult with somebody who will be able to guide you on that a little bit more.
I'd like to bring Dr. Armour in now. If you can just give us a little bit of insight into the research that you've been doing, what types of complementary therapies can support management of pain and symptoms as well for those with endometriosis?
That's an excellent question. It's complicated slightly by the fact that what is a complementary medicine or therapy? As Tracy just talked about, diet. Some of these anti-inflammatory diets, low FODMAP diets, for example. A few years ago, you consider perhaps dietary changes, to fall under that kind of complementary medicine or alternative medicine, and that's constantly changing what we think of as falling under complementary medicine. But I think what we can safely say is there's quite a bit of research which has happened on acupuncture. There is some happening on Chinese herbal medicine, and there is also been some research into yoga and kind of the mindfulness aspect. So my research into acupuncture has shown that it seems to be quite effective for people with endometriosis, the significant pain reductions. But it was a small study, and I think you'll probably hear that again and again, that endometriosis research unfortunately is still in its infancy in many areas, and we just need more work done. But acupuncture done regularly, so twice a week for 8 weeks, did show a reduction in pain of around 50%. So certainly worth investigating if you're struggling with pain symptoms. We currently have an ongoing trial at the moment on Chinese herbal medicine, but there is some evidence. It's not great, but there's certainly some evidence out of China about how these Chinese herbal medicine compounds reduce pain symptoms and potentially some indication that they may change the size of endometriosis lesions. But again, still early days. And also a small study on yoga showed some benefits for endometriosis there as well. And there's some great research going on at the moment around mindfulness. And while we don't have specific evidence for mindfulness in endometriosis at the moment, though the kind of mindfulness-based therapies certainly show some benefit for other types of chronic pain. So it makes sense that they'd probably be worth trying and probably be beneficial in endometriosis too.
I'm going to bring in Shannon now. Look, from your documentary to your TED Talk, everything in between, you have been such a brilliant spokesperson for those with endometriosis. I could listen to you talk all day. We've got a question that's come in from Emma, actually, and it's one that, as someone with endometriosis, I have been asked so many times, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Emma asks, how do we be persistent but firm with our GPs who don't listen, or with gynecologists who tell us our symptoms and what we are experiencing is all in our head?
Yes, so many people, I've also heard that question so many times when I've met different people with endometriosis as I've been filming, and I've literally talked to thousands of people around the world at this point. Being your own health advocate is scary, especially when you're not feeling well. And no matter if it's your first appointment or your 40th appointment, it can still be scary. So I usually share a few tips with people who ask me this question. And the first is just start with the appointment itself and be specific with yourself about what your goal is for the appointment, what you want. Before you go in your doctor's office, like tell yourself what your goal is. What do you want out of it? Another thing is just arm yourself with information. The more educated you can be before walking into the doctor's office, the better. And it can be overwhelming to research your condition online. And of course, there's a lot of misinformation and biased sources as well. But if you spend a little time vetting sources online from reputable places and learn what you can about your symptoms and potential treatments and their side effects, it can really take you a step further so that when you are walking in and having this conversation with your healthcare provider, you start in a more progressed place. The next thing I would say is don't be afraid to ask questions and really find your voice in the doctor's office. The healthcare provider is there to be a partner. It's not someone to be put on a pedestal. Yes, they maybe have gone to school for a long time and know a lot of medical jargon, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they know you and your body best. It's really meant to be a collaboration. And with whatever treatment you may be suggested, whatever medication, or maybe it's surgery, ask about side effects, short-term and long-term. Ask about alternative treatments. Be clear about your health goals. Is your goal fertility? Maybe it's not. Maybe it's pain relief. And be very clear with your healthcare provider about what your goals are so that you can both reach your goal together. Those are a few of the main things. Oh, one last thing I would say is keep your own records too. I've learned to be a meticulous record keeper with my health, and it's a lot easier in the digital age, but I've learned that if a healthcare provider sees that I've taken the time to be a meticulous record keeper about all of my doctor's visits and the medications I've been on and what's happened, diet, complementary medicine, I am taken more seriously.
Dr. Acton, just following on from what Shannon said, is that something that you hear from patients, that fear, that hesitation, the fact that they've been told perhaps in the past that this is something that is in their head, something that they are making up?
Yeah, unfortunately, all the time. I so often am faced with women who have been through such a journey before they are referred to see me, and tell me stories about that they have seen multiple people before, haven't had their symptoms taken seriously, or feel like they've been told it's in their head or that they should just go and have a baby. All the time. And I think it's really, really sad that that's the experience that they're having. And I think all of the tools that Shannon spoke about are really, really important. And it's about that being empowered and having ownership over their own health and their disease. And I think that's so super important for our patients moving forwards.
Dr. Khazali, I've got another question for you here. This does come from one of our endo warriors, Hazel. Hazel asks, how much do we know about adhesions and the catch-22 loop of needing surgery to remove them, but surgery also causing them to form?
Yes, that's one of the very important challenges that we face as surgeons, that, as Hazel says, surgery can cause adhesions. Should we therefore do surgery to remove those adhesions? I think there are a couple of points that we have to consider here. One is to differentiate between adhesion as a result of surgery and adhesion as a result of endometriosis, because endometriosis itself causes adhesion and fibrosis, scar tissue inside the pelvis. And if that is the case, then removing the endometriosis is a very good way of reducing the amount of those adhesions. I've often been surprised in the past where I had to go back and operate on some of my patients where there was very severe endometriosis. And I was expecting to see a lot of adhesions, but in fact, when the endometriotic lesions are removed completely, and if the surgical field is clean, and if the surgeon has been very meticulous in the amount of heat that they use, the fact that they leave the pelvis completely clear and clean, then adhesions form much less. We also know, and this is now yesterday's news, that laparoscopic surgery is associated with much less adhesion than open surgery. I really hope nobody is doing open surgery for endometriosis anymore. But that's one thing to consider, that in someone who has had significant amount of adhesions in the past as a result of open surgery, doing laparoscopic surgery to remove those adhesions doesn't necessarily mean that you will end up with the same amount of adhesions if the surgery is done correctly.
Dr. Khazali, in terms of the surgeries then that you're addressing, are we seeing a development in technology which is now less invasive for patients and therefore a better long-term outcome?
There are developments in surgery, and in particular in surgery for endometriosis, in almost all aspects of surgery. So we have new technology that gives us much better vision when we do our surgery. We have 3D technology. We have different energy modalities that helps us remove the disease more safely, more precisely. There is robotic surgery, and more companies have come into this field, which means sometimes more precise surgery and be able to do longer procedures more comfortably and more precisely. So in all aspects of surgery, we are seeing a lot of progress. But what excites me more than all of this is the data revolution. I believe that with technology and social media and being able to store information on the cloud, we're going to understand more and find answers to our big questions, like the one that you asked before, should we do surgery for adhesions or not? We're going to get the answer to those questions from big data, from large scale, real life studies, and that is going to be possible with the use of technology.
Tracy, this is another question for you. I know this is a topic that you have addressed and written on in the past. What role does the microbiome play in endometriosis?
Okay, so it's important first to just define the microbiome. So it's defined as the genetic material of all microorganisms that live on and in our bodies. And usually in the female reproductive system, there's specific bacteria in specific places, living in little communities. And there's different bacteria in different parts of that reproductive system. And usually those microbes live in harmony with us, and we call them friendly bacteria, and they work with us to produce some metabolic or important body functions. Now, in endometriosis, and the research is very early in this, there does seem to be a change in the type of bacteria that's present in specific parts of the reproductive system, or a bacteria that would normally be in a different part of the body, say in the bowel, can be in the reproductive system. And they're starting to investigate whether these bacteria are in the wrong place or in a unbalanced way, producing inflammatory compounds that can impact not only pain, but also from the way that estrogen is supported or metabolized or affected negatively. So these bacteria can have a big role in the estrogen side of things, plus inflammatory compounds that they can produce. What hasn't been established yet, however, is this bacteria, which one happens first? So does the endometriosis cause the change in the microbes being in the wrong place and cause them to produce these inflammatory compounds, or is it the alterations in the microbiome that contributes to the formation or the progression of endometriosis? So there's definitely more research that needs to be done in this area as well, but it's an exciting area.
Okay, Dr. Armour, I have a question for you from an endo warrior that's been sent in to us. Sarah asks, how can medicinal cannabis help endometriosis pain, and are there any studies on this? Plus, how can it be accessed?
Okay, a lot to unpack there, so I'll just go through it one by one. So the first part is medicinal cannabis, I guess, is the way of talking about legally prescribed, quality-controlled cannabis. And the two major compounds that we think of at the moment for medicinal cannabis are THC, which I think most people know, and also CBD, which if anyone's been on Instagram in the last year probably has come across as well. So there's lots and lots of compounds in medicinal cannabis, over a couple of hundred, I think, from last count. But these are the ones we often focus on. And so we've done quite a bit of research on medicinal cannabis, and we've found that most of it is self-reported so far, so we do still need some better studies. But what we know is that people with endometriosis who use medicinal cannabis, or in fact even use illicit cannabis, report significant pain reductions, and they also report improvements in other symptoms like sleep, improvements in their mood, and improvements in their gastrointestinal system. So nausea and bloating and things like that. And it seems like the THC is an important component of that. So there's obviously a lot of talk about CBD oil, but unfortunately at the moment, the evidence for CBD oil alone is pretty thin. So lots of interest, but not a lot of actual research has been done on that. But our research suggests that at least some THC seems to be really important. And also the way you take the medicinal cannabis. So whether you inhale it through, say, a vaporizer, or whether you take it ingested through like an oil. So if you inhale it, it works very, very quickly for pain. So it tends to reduce pain within about 5 minutes. But the pain relief is relatively short-lived, just an hour or two. If you take it, if you ingest it in oil, it takes much longer, about 60 to 90 minutes. Some people it takes up to 3 hours, much longer pain relief. And also, interestingly, if you ingest it, it seems to work better for gastrointestinal symptoms like bloating. So there's definitely some evidence there. We're doing some clinical trials and clinical research on that later this year, so keep an eye out for that. And how do you access it? Okay, so might surprise people, but any medical doctor in Australia can prescribe medicinal cannabis. So there are two pathways, the Special Access Scheme Category B and the Authorised Prescriber Scheme. So any GP using the Special Access Scheme Category B, we just call it SAS Cat B for obvious reasons, can fill in a form and they can prescribe medicinal cannabis. However, a lot of GPs have said that they don't really feel comfortable doing this. They don't have enough expertise, enough training. And so most people will end up going through a cannabis clinic, and they are part of what's called the Authorised Prescriber Scheme, and it's easier for them. So if you want to access medicinal cannabis, first person to speak to is either your GP or your gynaecologist, but it is getting easier to access and it's also getting more affordable.
Shannon, I suspect there is a very good reason why your documentary is titled Endo What. I'd really like to get your perspective in the years that you've been talking to people, travelling, having discussions about the topic of endometriosis. Have you noticed that there has been a shift in the conversation, a shift in the awareness? Because when I was first diagnosed, I didn't know how to say it, I didn't know how to spell it, I knew nothing about it. But it seems there has been a bit of a shift in recent years. What do you think?
I definitely think there's been an enormous shift in recent years. I mean, there's definitely a reason why the film was called Endo What, because I heard it so many times when I would say, yes, I have endometriosis. I have this thing called endometriosis. countless times I heard endo what? And this is across the spectrum, but very highly educated people, well-meaning people, but literally had no idea what in the world I was talking about. Yes, that has changed a lot for many reasons. And I'm really excited about that. I'm galvanized by, the international wave of, communication about the disease, about menstrual health issues, whereas before there were, was a culture of stigma and taboo around below the waist issues in women. So I'm really excited about the active role that patients are taking to drive this progress. And that was really a goal of Endo What, is to really give power in the hands of patients by education, by giving them a tool to not only learn more about, give them an accurate base of knowledge about the disease, and then they can go on and then with their individual providers find individualized care. But it's really helped, along with so much work by many organizations around the world and advocates who are really just finding their voices, and whether it be online or in the real world, the three-dimensional world, it's really driving a lot of change. And not only for awareness and education among patient populations, but way beyond that. For example, creation of clinical guidelines, policy decisions like allocation of research funding in Australia and the US and beyond, and due in large part to people speaking up, to the film, to social media and online patient groups. Patient advocates are becoming more savvy, and as a result are demanding a seat at the table alongside other stakeholders like healthcare providers and government leaders. And due to these online conversations among all of the stakeholders, everybody can better understand patient needs and support them by lifting their voices within these online spaces, yes, but also including the patient experience in pivotal real-world conversations where otherwise they may not have had a voice. And that's something I feel like didn't really exist 7 or 8 years ago, or if it did, I was certainly not privy to it. So I'm really excited about that.
Before we let you all go, I would like to ask one last question of you each, and we would love to finish on a positive note as we look forward to the future. And I will start with you, Dr. Acton. In your role as a gynaecologist and the title that you carry, what is the latest advancement in endo that you are excited about?
Okay, so there are probably two main things that excite me about endometriosis in what I do day to day at the moment. The first one is the mantra that is now internationally is that every patient deserves a high volume gynecologic surgeon. So this is something that's really taken power probably in the last 5 years, but sort of more and more as time goes on. So there is really good evidence within any surgical specialty, but particularly within gynecology and specifically within endometriosis, to say that if women have their surgery done by someone who does endometriosis surgery all the time, that they will have improved outcomes, both from the surgery, but then moving forwards. And I love that we're talking about this. It was a topic of discussion at the Ages Endometriosis meeting a couple of years ago, and it's been moving forward and continuing the discussion since then. Within that, in Australia, we've had the development of the Ages Training Fellowship, where we are taking gynecologists who have already completed their 6 years of general training and then are doing 2 further years in advanced laparoscopic surgery. So we are actually starting to produce well-rounded, well-trained surgeons who are equipped with the skills to manage a really, really tricky disease. And I think that's exciting for the specialty and for patients out there. The second thing that's happened more recently that I think is really exciting is the introduction of the Slinda progesterone-only contraceptive pill here in Australia. So in Australia, we've been missing a progesterone-only pill that had good rates of creating amenorrhea. There's a pill called Cerazette, which a lot of our patients had heard about, but weren't able to access within Australia. And I think Slinda is very exciting to see where it moves for our endometriosis women.
Dr. Khazali, this question for you. Are there progressions in your field that you're looking forward to?
Yes, I have to say I completely agree with what Dr. Acton just said, that centralization of endometriosis care is really the key here. In the UK, we've been very fortunate. We've been doing the projects of British Society of Gynaecology accredited endometriosis centers from 1999. And this has led to very good research and very good outcome for many of our patients. It's not perfect, but this is a right direction. And like Dr. Acton, I'm very optimistic that this worldwide is going to lead to better outcome. The empowerment of our patients is another thing that I've noticed very, very clearly, that our patients now are able to be in the driving seat and take charge of their care. They are able to demand good care. And I'm very optimistic seeing that too. Technologically, I believe that, I know I'm repeating myself a little bit here, but I'm really excited about big data. I'm excited about the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning in what we do, in all aspects of what we do. For example, take the example of patients being able to talk to an app and tell what their symptoms are and get an idea of what direction they should go in terms of seeking help, what is likely to be causing their pains, all the way to assisting surgeons. We just recorded a documentary with the BBC in the UK using using augmented reality to look inside a woman's body who had endometriosis, and for them to see what we mean when we talk about chocolate cysts and adenomyosis, and for the patient to see and feel what the disease is and what the problem is inside them, gives them a much better understanding. So I think technology is the common theme in all of these progresses.
And what about you, Dr. Armour? What are the latest developments in your field, which is such a fascinating one? What are you looking forward to in terms of endometriosis moving forward?
I'd like to echo my colleagues on this one as well. Although not directly my area, I think these interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, whatever the term you'd like to use, such an important area of progress. You know, you've heard today about how acupuncture might be able to help, how pelvic physio might be able to help, how diet might be able to help, how surgery will be able to help. But, you know, where do you go? Who do you see? I think what Shannon mentioned before about you've got to become your own healthcare advocate, which is great, but really tiring. So, you know, being able to go to a place where there's lots of these modalities and they're working together is such an exciting area of progress. The next one is, we talk a lot about diagnosis, obviously, and the long delay. And one of the things that does get overlooked, I think, and there's great research in Australia to support this, is the diagnostic delay is decreasing significantly over time. And that's great. And unfortunately, that's not going to be for everybody. We're still going to, you know, things are not perfect, but the delay is decreasing and the data really supports that. So a lot of the work from Endometriosis Australia and other organizations is shortening that delay. And I think the guidelines and the better awareness and training amongst doctors as well is all contributing to that. So that's really something to be positive about. And that's only going to improve, I think, with the advancements in ultrasound. And finally, obviously, I am really excited about medicinal cannabis. I think, you know, like I said, a lot of the data we have at the moment is just anecdotal, it's self-reported, but there is just so much of it that I think that it is probably one of the more exciting areas where, you know, we might be able to advance and not only control pain, but other symptoms at the same time. And, one of the things I didn't mention before is there's definitely evidence to suggest that medicinal cannabis has what's called a substitution effect. And this is a fancy way of saying it reduces the need for other medications. And we do have some evidence in other conditions that it reduces opioids. And so I think most people would agree, if we can reduce opioid usage, it's a great thing. So I think those are the three things that I'm most excited about.
Ruth, as we're hearing, there really is so much to look forward to. There's so many positives in our corner, and I think women's health physiotherapy is one of them. It is really so beneficial. What are innovations or developments that you're keen to see in your field?
This is a really exciting time, in my opinion, for pelvic physio or women's health physiotherapy. Because to date, even though we've been treating endometriosis for several decades at least, what we've had to guide our clinical decisions have been extrapolated or borrowed from other disciplines. So we might be basing our treatments on chronic low back pain outcomes or chronic pelvic pain outcomes because we really don't have the research. This is a common thing. We really don't have the research specific to endometriosis and physiotherapy yet. So one of the things I'm really excited about in Australia at the moment, we've got a couple of great clinical trials running to look at the specific effects of physiotherapy modalities on endometriosis, which is going to be a great way to guide our clinical decision making. And the second thing I'm really excited about is the increasing awareness or the increased awareness of endometriosis in the physiotherapy community and the proliferation of wonderful young physiotherapists coming through who are really passionate about this area and wanting to help those who are suffering from endo.
Tracy, you're next. In terms of your field and moving forward with the research around endometriosis, what's exciting you?
Okay, so my excitement is always sparked with research around plant compounds. So Mike was talking about cannabis, which is a great area to look at. So I'm really excited about what he does in that area and what the other researchers do in that area. But I've also looked at some recent reviews and some ongoing studies looking at compounds from foods like rosemary and from soy and from broccoli sprouts and red wine. And the compounds that are in some of these foods called polyphenols have been shown in smaller studies to reduce some of the endometriosis symptoms because these compounds seem to be anti-inflammatory and antioxidant and have some signaling effect or sending messages within our body cells, which may be useful for endometriosis sufferers. So if these studies or more studies like this come out and are positive, they may be useful adjuncts alongside current medical treatments for endometriosis sufferers. And it might be an additional way that we can get people to start to introduce those compounds into their diet on a daily basis to make it a little bit more manageable and affordable for them.
Well, I don't know about you, Shannon, but Tracy had me at red wine. I definitely heard that part. Just listening to all of these speakers here today, Shannon, I really wish I had this support network around me 15 years ago because I feel like we've just come ahead leaps and bounds. Tell us, what are you looking forward to as we move forward in this field of endometriosis and the research around it?
First of all, I'm just really excited by this conversation that is happening and all of these amazing speakers. I mean, they're an absolute dream team, and I want to move to Australia. Can I do that now? The borders are open, right? No, I mean, I think progress is definitely going in the right direction. And it's so heartening. I've said for years that there are two vortexes that a patient goes through. The first is the long delay to diagnosis, and the second is the long delay to finding effective treatment. And we are really making enormous strides in both of those, closing both of those vortexes. The first with educational programs in schools, for example, and empowering young women to speak out about their symptoms and to know when something's not normal. And also educating frontline providers like nurses, pediatricians, OBGYNs, general practitioners to really be on the lookout for symptoms that aren't typical. of endometriosis. We're making enormous strides in that around the world. So that first vortex is really lessening, this long diagnostic delay. That's incredibly exciting. The second vortex, which is about the long delay to finding effective treatment, well, I think we're well on our way when we're talking about centralized multidisciplinary care centers. In Australia, I think that's amazing that that's happened. As Shaheen said, with the BSG, that's been happening since 1999. And we're working hard in the US as well to move toward that, because that's, of course, in my personal experience, what's been the most effective in living with endometriosis. And it seems that all evidence points that way as well. So really just excited about this conversation, and knowing that we can all move this way together is really heartening.
I'd like to thank each of our panellists for joining us today and sharing their valuable knowledge. Forums such as these are informative and necessary, but they're also so empowering for those with endometriosis. They say knowledge is power, and if we can learn and understand more about this disease, how to best manage and treat it, no matter what stage of life we're in, we will be much better for it. So thank you again for your time and insight. So stay with us. Coming up next, Dr. Mike Armour, Chair of Endometriosis Australia's Clinical Advisory Committee, and Alexis Wolfe, CEO of Endometriosis Australia, take us through some of the research updates involving Endometriosis Australia.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm joined by Dr. Mike Armour, who is the chair of the Clinical Advisory Committee for Endometriosis Australia, but also the chair of the research committee for our grant program. I wanted to start off by asking you if you could talk a little bit about that grant program and some of its aims and objectives to share with some of our endo warriors.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what a lot of people don't realise is that when researchers are employed by universities where our salaries are paid, but if we want to actually do any research, we need funding. And I think one of the things which has come up a lot in the panel discussion is you've heard the phrases, we need more research, there's not enough research, the research is preliminary. And so the fantastic thing about Endometriosis Australia's research grant program is we look at what we call seed funding. So often to get the big amounts of funding from the government or these other bodies of, hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions of dollars, we need some data. So we need seed funding. So this is funding that provides money to do these smaller or preliminary experiments, and we need that data to be able to take to the government or these other funding bodies and say, hey, look at this cool idea, we've done some work, it looks really promising, can we have a lot more money? And without that seed funding, it's so difficult to really progress research, because unfortunately, despite being so common, endometriosis still gets a fraction of the funding of diabetes, heart disease, dementia, all of these things. So without Endometriosis Australia's grants, it really would struggle for many researchers to get into endometriosis research.
Absolutely. And I think what's really exciting is that the program really hopes to encourage more researchers to actually stay in endometriosis research. As you said, it's something that many people have heard about, but not necessarily have thought of a career in terms of sticking with endometriosis to research for their career.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, that is a big issue. Without funding, researchers can't follow that career. So it's really important. And one of the things that the research grants do is they encourage what we call early career researchers, which are people who are just finished their PhD or soon after, to be involved, and help build their research track record and their expertise so they can become, expert endometriosis researchers.
Absolutely. And so last year, Endometriosis Australia awarded $100,000 in grant funding. Can you tell us a little bit about the 3 projects that were selected and why perhaps you actually selected them as part of the committee?
Sure. So all of the projects were ranked by all of the different committee members, but one of the things we were absolutely looking for is a breadth of research, so looking at different areas which are going to have different results in different times. So because they're seed funding, they're all projects which need to be completed within about 12 months. Some of these are going to put results out really quickly. Some of them, like I said, are going to be that stepping stone to bigger projects. But the 3 projects are
We have Professor Caroline Ford and her team, and they're going to be looking at basically why different phenotypes or different types of endometriosis seem to respond differently, end up in different places in the body and respond in different ways. Second one is Dr. Brent McKinnon and his team, and they're looking at environmental and external factors for endometriosis. So what, does it cause endometriosis? Does it drive its development? And then finally, Dr. Christina Curry and her team, and they're looking at developing a menstrual education program, which they already have a pilot of, a small one, and then what we're going to do with that is we're improving accessibility. So we're looking at what do teachers need, what do parents need, what do guardians need, because often when young people have their period, it's their parents that they go to, often their mum, they might Google it, but also they have, classes at school. How do we make sure good information's getting there? So we can identify things like, if you're having severe period pain and you're vomiting in the bathroom or you're passing out, you need to go and speak to someone. And so that's really important. We all know that the information given about periods tends to be not so great in schools at the moment, unfortunately, or it's incomplete. So great breadth of projects, lots of exciting stuff that's going to come out of that. So by the end of 2022, we should have some, these projects will all close, and by early 2023, we should have some exciting, even if they're preliminary results. So, watch Endometriosis Australia social media.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully by next March, we'll be able to give you much more information on those projects and how they've succeeded. I love that there's that balance for research in terms of that, as you were mentioning, short-term, long-term, some quick wins for endo warriors. And I love that idea around really the supporting people with endo in schools, because we know that a lot of young people experience symptoms quite early, and that if we can get onto it early with diagnosis, then treatment outcomes can just be so much better.
So much better.
Yeah, fabulous. So at Endometriosis Australia, we've been working on a little bit of a secret project. So Dr. Mike Armour and a number of collaborators from across the globe are looking into some research around workplaces. Now, we've been following a lot of patient feedback on social media around how difficult it is to stay gainfully employed when you have symptoms that can sometimes be really challenging to predict. So we have recognised that the workplace is a really critical area for us to be doing some research on. So Dr. Mike Armour, can you tell us a little bit about the project that we're about to be launching and what endo warriors can expect?
Absolutely. So like you say, we did some preliminary research last year looking at how COVID-19 and the changes in how we work affected endo warriors. And we found, perhaps not too surprisingly, being able to work from home for most people, not everybody, but most people, it really improved their ability to manage their symptoms, and they felt so much more productive. So obviously, unfortunately, it doesn't seem like we're going to be working from home forever. So what we want to do is we're trying to find out what can we do at work across a variety of different kind of industries to help endo warriors maintain, their employment. So a lot of people say, I had to cut down to part-time, I got fired, I got passed over for promotions. So rather than something like menstrual leave, which is there to kind of deal with, the problem, we're trying to see, well, what can we do to help endo warriors cope better at work? So they don't have to take leave, so they don't feel like they're constantly missing out, And so this is everything from, potentially being more flexible with start and finish times, being able to take breaks, being able to access places where they can lie down. How can they use heat at work? All of these different things. But where it starts is it starts with those with endometriosis. We want to know, what do you want? What do you need? What's helped you? What hasn't? So that's the exciting first step of our project. So we'll be releasing a survey, so watch this space, and we're going to ask as many endo warriors as we can to fill that in. Next step after that is we'll be doing some workshops for those that are interested, and there we're going to really look at lots of different industries and try and dive deeper in. What do you really need, and how can we make this work? Next step is employers. talking to them. What can we do? We might have lots of ideas. What's going to be practical for them to implement? And then finally, a policy, that we can offer, an endometriosis workplace policy. So it's going to be a long road. It's not an overnight thing like most research, but we're so excited to be starting this because it's such an important area. Endometriosis is such an expensive disease. Like you just heard from the panel members, you've got surgeons, you might go and see an acupuncturist, a nutritionist, a naturopath, a pelvic physio. If you want to use medicinal cannabis, everything costs money. And at the moment, it's about, making sure that people are able to stay employed, so at least out of the many, many worries that they might have with their endometriosis, being able to afford their treatments is not one of them.
Yeah, look, it sounds like such an exciting project. And what I really love about it is just all of the practical tools that we're going to be able to provide both endo warriors and employers so that they can have really safe conversations, but also really make sure that we're meeting both the needs of the employer and the employee. And there's not that fear that endo warriors are going to lose their jobs by having this conversation to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important to be able to communicate needs without feeling judged by your employer or by your colleagues. And, we're really excited about this project. We really think that it is going to make that difference.
Absolutely. And so we know that research, it costs money. It's got to come from somewhere. Endometriosis Australia is currently predominantly funded by the public, by endo warriors themselves, their families. They do fundraising, they bake cakes, they wear yellow, they do all sorts of manner of things to make sure that they can support an organisation like ours. So, in terms of things that people can do, donating to Endometriosis Australia, going to our website, endometriosisaustralia.org, making a donation, whether that's a one-off or a regular donation, can really have an impact on the research that we're doing, and to make sure that we're delivering items that can be really impactful for endo warriors in the future.
Absolutely. As much as we'd like to do research without money, and sometimes we can, a lot of the stuff we just need the funding. So it's incredibly helpful that Endometriosis Australia is allocating this money for research grants, and obviously we couldn't do it without those people donating. So thank you so much for your donations and support. There's so many researchers for endometriosis in Australia. I think many people don't realise it's not always in the media, but there is so much going on, and we really appreciate your support. And if I could also say one other thing, obviously financial support is wonderful, but if you do see a call for research and you're interested, please participate. We can't do this without you. We want to make sure that what we're doing is what is needed by endo warriors. And so your input is so vital.
It's such a great point, and because I think a lot of people think that research also from a patient perspective should be as simple as just filling in a 5-question survey, but it's not always the case. While researchers will always try and make it as easy as possible for endo warriors to fill in, there are on occasions going to be some types of research that are going to require a little bit longer of an investment, maybe 40 minutes of their time, but it is vital that those people actually do participate because it helps researchers immensely.
Absolutely. No research without patients. So we couldn't do it without you. Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon.
So that concludes the 2022 Endometriosis Australia Symposium for Endo March. Wherever you have tuned in from across the globe, we hope you are taking away some new information or are reaffirmed in your knowledge about the disease and how you can live your best life with endometriosis. Thank you for joining us today, and a special thanks goes out to all our donors as well. It is through donations from the public that Endometriosis Australia can bring you events just like this. So please visit endometriosisaustralia.org to find out more ways you can learn about endo and support the brilliant work that they are doing. Until next year, stay healthy, stay happy, and let's all keep working towards a future where we can end the endo stigma and find a cure for endo warriors.